Greetings, class. Today's subject is history. For some of you, this may still be a recent memory, whereas for others, this will be ramblings of a bygone era. Whether you're here for a trip down nostalgia lane, or you want to understand just what the boomers are talking about when they say the good old days, buckle up, because we are going on a romantic Ferris wheel ride. A non-rotating game like Vanguard is inevitably subject to some form of power creep. Without removing high power, high impact cards from the viable card pool now and again with rotation, in order to retain stable sales of new product, you either have to ban the most recent hotkit on the block like Yu-Gi-Oh does, or you have to continually push out new product that's bigger, better, and more appealing. This has been the case since the beginning, and we're obviously no strangers to it with Overdress. But there was a period of around 5 to 6 months towards the end of the G era, which everyone has referred to as the Ferris Wheel meta, as you can tell from the title of the video. Because just like a Ferris wheel, it never stopped moving, and whatever just came up was the top of the Ferris wheel, it was on top of the meta. And even though throughout this entire 4 or 5 years since that point in Vanguard's history, that was still a unique time frame because we haven't had anything like that since then. Sure, new decks come and go, the newest set is like really good, but there have always been previous decks and sets that have still been viable or played in some way, shape, or form. Each new release didn't fundamentally change the game of Vanguard at its core principles like it did back then. So, as well as explaining the story of those of you who didn't live through this, we'll also be diving into a bit about why this happened, how it happened, and what it was like as someone playing in that time. So before we break down and analyze what the Ferris wheel actually is, we should define it. So, in 2017, December, Vanguard's G era has been going for about 2 or 3 years now. It's been pretty good. We've had some hiccups, some slight issues like time leap, 7 Cs, and ripples, but for the most part, the game has been stable and reasonable. It's been enjoyable for the last few years. People have constantly been playing it, people have updated their decks, old decks have been somewhat playable, although there are a few children who, let's just say, didn't get the right level of support. Everything's been around, and the Link Joker clan booster, GCB06, or Rondeau of Chaos and Salvation, has just come and gone. It's pretty cool. There's some new pieces for Chaos, some new pieces for Messiah, but the real winner is Deleter. Of course, we do have GBT13 and Ultimate Stride coming around the corner in a few weeks with the World Finals in January, but let's focus on right now and Link Joker. Efames and Zuiji are 2 new Deleters that have pretty much given the deck the exact sort of speed and power pump it needed. Deleters can now resolve Given and continue to extend with multiple attacks, while still having that very strong during your turn your opponent has 0 power, which is great for pushing aggro, especially in an era like G, where the format was all about 5k shield, hitting for magic numbers with 11 and 16k power. These sort of small pokes becoming 20k shields was crushing, especially because there weren't that many good G guards yet either. Anyway, up until this point, the meta was still largely GBT12 decks like Ichikashima, Drag Strider, and Gear Next, as well as Darkness still being around. The environment was very balanced and pretty varied, which was actually a good thing. Of course, the new booster shook things up a tiny bit, but not beyond recognition. It added Deleter to the mix, and now Deleter was like, okay, this is a deck to play for Worlds, on top of the existing ones I just mentioned. Sure, GBT12 did kind of replace a lot of everything before this. Up until this, it was like Overlord, Time Leap, Night Rose, Blasters, and these had now just fallen by the wayside just because of the raw quality of BT12. But it hadn't completely replaced the game. It was just, here's the hot new things and they're better. Vanguard had this before. And after all, the exact same thing was about to happen with GBT13. We've got Resist Thavas and Overlord being the hot new decks on the block from the new set. Except the difference here is that the average card quality in these 2 decks were much higher than anything we'd seen up until that point. Clan Booster 06 and GBT12 had a few double Rs and triple Rs that were whatever and just considered throwaway pack filler, but nearly every single card in GBT13 for these 2 decks, right down to the rares and the commons, were absolute gas. The other clans in GBT13 did kind of okay, like Dol Paladin, Tachikaze, and Murakumo, all got some very powerful tools, but not to the same level as Stavas and Overlord. It actually reached the point where for Worlds, none of the GBT12 decks were legitimate contenders. There was no reason to play Shaharat, Time Leap, Ichikashima, when Thavas, Overlord were just way better. Only Deleters was the only thing that could really still compete up until that point.
So basically it was 2017. I had just won France BCS with ZTV. The format was still pretty fresh. I was looking down to see what sets would maybe make a difference, and I was very interested in Rondeau of Chaos, I think, which was a Link Joker set that was bringing the new Messiah and Chaos support. I was looking into Chaos quite a lot, but I saw it still missed some consistency pieces. Although it could lock a lot of cards, that was mostly what made me think, well, I don't want to take Luard, because there was points in where when you get like 3 locked as a Luard player, like when you get 3 circles like non-usable, you just cannot play freely. You just cannot play the same game. So I was already very keen on not taking Luard, which was the deck that I thought was the best after France. In France, I played ZTB, but I played against a bunch of Luard, so I really thought that Luard could be, like, if mastered, if played correctly, could be the answer to play in Worlds. Sadly, as I said, Rondeau of Chaos kind of shake that thought of mine, and I started looking into OTT, but then OTT was also very weak Chaos, so I was more or less inclined to play Chaos or play a Link or play, like, I don't know, like if Worlds would be full of Chaos, I'll play Messiah. But then GVT 13 came around, and whoa, it like changed everything for me. Like, I started playtesting, and I suddenly realized that Chaos had a big problem, which was, well, there's Sabas now, which has a heal card that unlocks, which is insane, and there's Overlord, which is retiring like a bunch. Like, it's just a better control deck. Like, Overlord adds the better G guards. It had the better strides, it had everything that a control deck needed to have apart from locking, but it didn't matter because the retire was just so oppressive that there was nothing, for example, Luard could do. Like, when I played in France, the reason I beat so many Luards was because I was using the ZTB grade 2, which would bot deck a card from my opponent's field to bottom deck, yeah? And because of that, I was utilizing Dragheart's skill to go through from deck, which is so important for Luard to get their turn started. And as the Overlord player, it just can nuke the whole board, and that Dragheart can't retire anything, and that's just the same thing. They couldn't get the turn started. So that was basically, I was pretty sold on Overlord, like, from the get-go. I was also looking into Thavas because, I mean, Alexandros just came out, like, the deck was insane. Like, the deck was really good. Like, it could do a bunch of attacks. This link was incredible. Like, everything, like, and multi-attacks, right? Like, between the control deck, the multi-attack deck, I was always more keen to take the multi-attacking decks. Then I started testing some mirror matches, and, like, boy, in my opinion, the Overlord mirror match was very, very interesting for that, because Overlord is known to be a Vanguard search trick deck. I mean, through the years, like, always resigning the Vanguard and all of that. So your rearguard shouldn't matter as much, but when both people are playing just like Vanguard resigning Unga Bunga, you have to think about it like, whoa, okay, so what does make the differences in that? And it really was the rearguards, like one extra column to get trigger power, or to like get the stand trigger, the Blaze stand trigger, which is a really cool tech. To go back to the deck, give 5k to something and draw 1. It's very nice to refill your deck with triggers, especially with Overlord, because the games were lasting like a lot of time. Like, you'll get very like thin deck and always check triggers by the end of the game. So rearguards was very important in the Overlord mirror match. And going into Worlds, I was really like playtesting the mirror a lot with a friend of mine from Greece, and we would just playtest like hours and go like, well, you shouldn't have called a rearguard there, that was too soon, or you should have actually called your rearguard. You knew I was kind of like pressured, not enough hand to guard. You should have actually pressured a bit more on the wound. So I would say those were my like world preparations. Like, I very quickly gave up on Chaos, but I still had in mind that I couldn't take Lord. Now, not only because of Chaos, but also because of Overlord and the board control it provided. And sadly, Dragheart was always a very fragile card, I would say. To like, if you didn't have ward, you couldn't use the skill. So yeah, it was really the problem with ward at the time.
And it really was like that. Those three decks took up an overwhelming majority of the room, with the next fourth most played deck being Chaos, and that was only slightly straggling behind Deleters, which was already straggling behind the other two. Of course, Blasters did win Worlds in the end, but that was purely something that caught everyone by surprise, and made waves for being the rogue pick, piloted by a man with loads of charisma, rather than because of the raw strength of the deck. In any case, what was unprecedented about GPT-13 going into this meta was the fact that how much the newest product release blew away the previous decks out of the water.
GPT-13 also gave support to a bunch of older decks, although like none of them really matched to what Tavas and Overlord like were really like doing. Like till now in G we had the obviously cursed grade 1 gaming era and grade 2 gaming era, which, well, sadly didn't really let us have much fun. But apart from that, we had a bunch of fun with Nitros. Nitros is a really good deck. TikTok Melon, like Time Leap was a really good deck. Like everything around that, like had been a good deck. So from GPT-12 onward, CTB, OTT, and Luard were like the decks to take. Like if you wanted to play the game, those were the decks to take. But even then, there were like close rogue picks, you know. Like I remember in France, I played like in a bunch of tournaments, like against Fenrir, which had the Taro Loop, and I played against Spikes, which had the like GV8 combo, which was like, okay, if your game takes too long, I'm just gonna blow you out of the water, and it's like, okay, that's very scary. So it was very scary at the time, and we always had Mo like trolling with like Susano and just like winning a BCS. Like Mo's insane, like always has been. And like the meta was pretty diverse, but when a deck, like when suddenly a control deck comes around, you would have like a strong control deck, like a very, 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 very oppressive retire that could just wipe your whole board out of nowhere, like Overlord, and still have like if you try to push back, I will just deny Griffin your combo if you're trying to combo. I'll just defeat flare your back row if you need it. Like there was an answer to everything. Like that's what I always said. Like Overlord just it wasn't that Overlord was specially broken, especially like later down the line when more things came out. We learned that Overlord wasn't actually like very like good on like itself. Like it wasn't the ceiling of the deck. It was just the oppression, like the sheer amount of retire that was actually oppressing other players from actually try to fight back, like try to play the game, like try to. Lord didn't have regard. ZTB, all the combos were shut down by Andy Nile Griffin on the Unicorn or the Defeat Flare on all the like. No, not the Unicorn. The Unicorn and all a Defeat Flare on the ship. So another deck that couldn't do anything. ODT actually had a Shikishima, but it didn't like it suffered a lot just from basic board control, like just from basic retire, just from basic wiping the board. And yeah, like these last three sets were roller coaster, like GPT-11, GPT-12, GPT-13, like everything was changing from month to month, and it was actually very fun. And it just happened that Worlds was after GPT-13, so yeah, like most decks couldn't face Overlord, and neither could face Tavas, because Tavas just became the best deck. Like Tavas was can't be defeated by Chaos in any shape or matter. Like as a bunch of resist, as a unlocking G-Guard, does more attacks than any deck in the game could do. I mean, the ZTV full combo did about the same number of attacks, and okay, it was a bit more consistent, but it wasn't as good against the control matchups as Tavas was.
And after the dust had settled from Worlds and everyone was settling into the Thavas and Overlord metagame, the next cabin in the Ferris wheel was already on its way. GEB02, the Awakening Zoo, was a very well-received product at first. All three clans that it had supported had been considered very weak throughout most of their G-era incarnations. Mega Colony picked up one or two tops here and there, but was a surprise pick most of the time, but for the most part, Neo Nectar and Great Nature were never really tournament winner material. What marked the paradigm shift this time was the design principle of the cards, specifically GR Strides and their ilk. Up until this point, in general, GRs were GB2 or GB3 high impact finisher cards that you would go into to round out a game, barring Gancelot. Most of the time at this period, your first stride was some double R or triple R that gained you a little bit of advantage and pushed a little bit of aggro, but were never truly game-winning cards on their own. They were only played at 1 or 2 copies in the G zone and were generally only used when you needed a decisive finishing masterstroke. GBT13 changed this. Alexandros was an easy first stride that could also end the game, and even though you couldn't get 5 drives on the first stride, the Purge still being able to ping your opponent for free while also generating overlords in the soul, which is what you needed, was still pretty good compared to most of Kagro's other first stride options. However, Aquaforce still had the likes of Lambros, who didn't need counterblast, and Wailing Thavas, who became unguardable as real finishing options, while the Overlord still had Ziegenberg for its nice solid restanding. With GEB02, the 3 GRs that were released became more or less the only stride that these clans ever needed again. Velhelmina's true strength of giving a crit was unlocked to GB4, sure, but that was now second stride rather than third. It still gave you multi-attack and consistency on the first stride. Similar story with Overwhelm. The plus 3k was like, whatever. What you really cared about was the fact that they flipped and they plussed immediately. Even Balrog in particular is still played as one of the main strides for Great Nature even to this day. Before this, all 3 green clans were considered to have a frail and unimpactful game plan and playstyle, and these strides single-handedly changed that. Velhelmina gave Neonectar not only a way of multi-attacking, but a way to even more reliably pump numbers and clone names on the board. Balrog did everything that the Great Nature Stride wanted. It gave you power, it drew you cards, and it retired your rear guards. And Overwhelm? That was the real star of the show. She turned Mega Colony from a mediocre board control deck with no real way to press the tempo or advantage into a powerhouse that would not only reward you for stunning your opponent's board, but also punish your opponent if they didn't play around the stun. Overlord and Thavas were still good, but they couldn't really keep up with the endless offensive pressure from these new decks, especially given the fact that these decks were trying to grind out the game and play slow, while all the Zoo decks were running out of the gate on the first stride. So, strong aggro pushed grind and control out of the format. How do you push out strong aggro? What did the next set have to do? The answer was go bigger and wider, and that's exactly what Galaxy Stargate GEB03 did. Dimension Police reliably slapped the biggest numbers the game had ever seen on the table, while Nova Grappler was consistently exceeding the 4 or 5 attack limit we'd become used to. Plus, all 3 variants of Link Joker got nice bumps in consistency and could now extend their plays while still controlling the board like they did before. Chaos could now rip loads of cards out of your hand thanks to Close combined with Deluge. Meanwhile, Messiah's GR, Integral, now gave the deck a guaranteed win con. If the game went on long enough, you would hand reset and the game would be over on that turn. Nova Grappler in particular became capable of doing everything. While X-Gallop was a very cool restander, it was still very one-dimensional and was just a slightly better Overlord with a bit more of an aggro theme. Nova Grappler though could play around aggro, could play around control, and still come out on top. And if you want to see exactly what the deck could do at that point, here's a link to a very handy combo video we released a few years ago that's still relevant to this day.
So, talking a bit about the Boss Worlds experience. So in Worlds, actually, as we know, like in 2019 too, I was already seeing Japanese players playing the future, you know, like going like, whoa, what are these guys playing? And like, they were playing already Gridor. And I was at the time, I'm like, wait, let me look what these decks do. And I gotta be honest, if you played Neos or Great Nature into Overlord, you were in bad shape. You were in very bad shape. Like, Denial Griffin will just shut down a full Crane Tiger turn, and Neonectar, like, I didn't get that many experience, but it just didn't feel that good against the massive oppressive point of Overlord. But Fedora itself was a different beast on its own, not gonna lie. It was even more control. Which is funny, because we are in a meta where we think, okay, Overlord is just the best deck of control. If you want to go around with Chaos, it's okay. But overall, me your main form of control, and then what gets around is the card that just goes like +4, which was Overwhelm, and like gets a bunch of drives, and suddenly the deck, another control deck comes in. But Overlord against Gridora was quite interesting matchup because Overlord only needs the column that Eudora was locking and wasn't calling maybe rear guards while it was eating Mega Colony Sport. So it was an actual interesting matchup. I think that's why Eudora didn't shine as much as it should, because Overlord just seemed to have the upper end on that matchup. But against everything else, Eudora was just a good deck, like just as viable, just as playable, like very good, but again, in the face of the control king that was Overlord at the time, it just couldn't like show into the meta game as properly. So I'll just skip a bit to this set and go like directly to what the big beast Stargate. We are at a time where we are playing 40 minutes games or some shit, like a lot, like really long games, okay? Like we are playing really long games with like really grindy options, and then we are expecting more chaos. And I'm like, okay, so what's going to happen? It's going to be even more controlled. And boy, was I wrong. We got Victor, Zubat Victor, and Winning Champ, I believe it's the name. All I know is that if I've ever seen a deck that's fast, that's the deck. Like, bro, that deck would go to GB4 or turn 3. That deck would flip its stride like it was butter. Like, I don't even know what to tell you. And we got the Chaos support also, which was, okay, Close was scary. Like, in all honesty, Close was like Chaos Breaker Close, I believe it's the name, the one that forces you to lock from hand. It was very scary. Like, the deck was scary, don't get me wrong, but it came in the literal same set as Better Tavas, which is Victor. I'm just gonna be straight up, like, Tavas, I thought Tavas was broken, but I wasn't ready to what was coming. And it's quite funny because in the end of this story, I get to GBT 14 meta and I pick up a Tavas deck for no reason, and I play it against like a bunch of decks and I just lose everything. Like, it just became a meme of how really complete deck it was. I was like, wait, but this World was broken. Like, bro, I played against this. This was insane. But now it was just mediocre. Like, the meta just evolved that much fast in that short amount of like 4 months, something like that. Like, it was really, really, really fast. Like, it was evolving really fast. Like, Zubat Victor was game changing. Like, counter charging, soul charging, you name it. Need unlock, we have a heal guard for that. Need GBA turbo, we can do that. Need favorite champ to need, like, I think it was favorite champ now. Need favorite champ to like do 10 attacks for you in a turn, kill your opponent before he can even close his eyes. Yeah, we can also do that. Like, Victor could do everything. Everything that you wanted it to do, it did. And while me, person, and why do I have this much like whoa against Victor is because like at the time I was trying to play funsies with Messiah, and I gotta tell you, it was not the player. Messiah was an okay deck against Overlord because you could stall and go into Integral, put its hand to 5, and try to kill and to pray that it didn't draw the Denial Griffin for your Lady Fencer, which was basically what would happen. Like, if you mull his hand back, he didn't draw the heal guard, you'd win. But if you played Messiah in that meta, you had advantage against Chaos, but then you played Messiah against Victor, and it just felt awful. Like, it just felt you were doing nothing. It just felt his deck was 3 times better than yours, and you were not getting to Integral in that matchup. So playing Messiah was a bit of eye roll from me. Like, I always loved the artworks and aesthetics of Messiah, and so like at the time, I really wanted to play the deck. But in a competitive environment, I must be honest, you were basically praying to play against all the control, because you were actually quite decent in the control because of Integral. Like, okay, you want to take the game longer, I'll just put your hand to 5 and kill you this turn. So the deck actually had some edge against control, but the thing was, what everyone should be playing or was playing was Victor. Like, that deck will just outperform Messiah, will just outperform new support Chaos, will just outperform Overlords, and I don't really know about the Gridora matchup, but I imagine that will be an interesting one, because that feels about one deck of control that maybe Victor would just like boom out of the plate.
The main thing that Stargate did compared to everything is that it really pushed the end rate for how quickly decks could now set up their game plan, and it also pushed the game to a point where decks no longer needed to go out of their way for their game plan to set up their finisher. Nowadays, you're used to having your game plan naturally tend towards your finisher, whereas back then, you actually had to play to a finisher. But with winning champ being both your finisher and your setup at the same time, that wasn't relevant anymore. Same with X-Gallop. It was your finisher and your setup. And it's that progression of game speed that really led to this paradigm shift. So at this point, you might be thinking, surely this is it. How can it be better than this? GBT14 was heralded back then as the beginning of the end, when in reality it was the end. And it made the outstanding move to remove Generation Break from a lot of cards. Altmal and Luard now started playing the game from as early as turn 1, while ZTB and Dominate, which already were good decks, now had win right now buttons that they could just press starting from the second stride. That's right, reliable, second stride, win now. And if that wasn't enough, Altmal also had an insane GR that you could first stride for intense pressure while becoming a game-ending second stride on top. The only decks that didn't end up becoming meta with this booster were Regalia and Shaharit. Regalia was still good, but it didn't have that much support considering that it was a revival of a Limit Break archetype, and without Yggdrasil and Norn that we have today, it didn't have the same intensity or the extensions that you needed to make a splash back then. Shaharit received Balam and a few other nice consistency tools, and that enabled the first unguardable attacks. Well, you could still G-guard, so it wasn't quite Itchy Tom, but it was still very close. But the problem is that your finisher was still either that, or Gilles de Rais, or Bladermouse. There was no actual win now button, it was just a lot of good cards. Of course, Dark States in general did receive Dust, which was very, very close to being a win now button, but Dust did receive an errata on day 0, so it wasn't quite as game-ending as the likes of Heritage. Now, up until this point, I've been purposefully not mentioning the Xerath Dragons. We did receive Drachma in GPT-13, which wasn't very relevant, and Megiddo, which was pretty good, as well as obviously Stark, which was amazing, and Zoa, which was kind of whatever for Zoo. But the reason I didn't speak about the Xeraths at this point is for a very good reason. Because the main thing in GPT-14, as well as printing Dust and Ultima, which were the best Xerath Dragons, we got Geese. Yep, that's Geese. Geese was the reason that people were calling GPT-14 the beginning of the end. Angel Feather got its support in GPT-13, but it didn't make much waves because Rescue wasn't that strong, at least not compared to Overlord and Thavas. Well, this was their time to shine. Geese was exactly what Angels needed, and Angels gave Geese exactly what it needed. It was the perfect trade-offer. You have a deck that gains loads of extra trigger checks, but has no real win con and no way to close out the game before decking out and stalling out. Meanwhile, you have this weird, almost unbeatable win con that just needed you to get a little bit lucky with triggers and have good defensive options. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the meta at that point was entirely Luard, ZTB, and Dominate, with a little bit of Angel Geese floating around. Some Shaharit and some Altmal popped up now and again as well, but really GPT-14 was the new meta. Overlord and Thavas didn't even exist on the radar anymore, and Victor was just considered an unstable combo deck.
So for 2017, instead of having the normal teams plus singles tournaments that year, there was actually 2 singles tournaments where they had the day 1 and day 2 format. So if you went X2 on day 1, you were able to participate in day 2 and then do 3 rounds of Swiss, and then it was cut to top 8. So it was arguably the most competitive those Bushiroad tournaments have ever been, especially for Vanguard because they were also the biggest at the time. But notably, that meta shifted from decks where they needed Counterblast to play everything at a Counterblast effect on it to do something, like next stage was Counterblast to, you know, rewrite Jet from Heart. Luard needed Counterblast to do literally anything, but the massive design shift from that point was just all your broken cards are Soul Blast 1. Good example of this was like Gear Next. Drag Strider, that dude was a Soul Blast. No, it wasn't even Soul Blast, it was like discard 2 or discard X amount. It was whatever. Get the idea. Everything shifted from this can be prevented if you are smart with playing around your opponent to your opponent can do whatever they want whenever they want. And that changed the game from a fundamental level of less on denying your opponent resources at a higher level to you got to just push them and pray. Like that's just what it turned into. Especially with leading into like GBT 13 with Overlord and Thavas, which Ben covered earlier, and then you get into Zoo where I don't need to talk about Zoo. Then after you skip all those super fast 2 months where you get like Zoo, Stargate in like, I don't know, a month and a half. I think Stargate meta was like 2 weeks, where Victor was best deck. And then you finally get to the big set where everyone says this is the end of G, this is the worst meta ever, where it wasn't actually that bad, was the release of GBT14, where you had noteworthy cards like the Hari promo, which was a box topper. That was a big deal because it gave Hari a first stride that didn't suck, it played around lock, and then it bridged you into arguably the most broken Zeroth in all of G, which is Dust. So then you just dust them and then loop a million attacks at them while they're at 1 and they die. But there's better decks that dust you anyway. So going down the list, there was also Ultima. Wasn't super popular. Luard maybe strode into it, but that deck was kind of mid in that whole format. Then you got Fides, which was a busted ass card in Brave, but again, you're playing Brave at the end of G. You are losing to the broken deck that is Zodiac Time Beast, with the advent of Chronovisor Heritage, which is infamous for being the second stride, take an extra turn, attack you 16 times and cry, and the Chronojet Dragon Z, which just gave you perfect consistency every game. I don't think I've ever seen a Z2B player ever really brick. I played on teams that year with Nikki and got top 8. And Nikki smacked every game, first or second, and didn't really matter. He had perfect selection. He could go into the ZTB stride, go +5. I think I saw him like G-Guard 4 times against Ange and still win, but that's more end of G stuff. But going also down the list, there was Rene and Zenki, the infamous hand rip deck, because Rene would force your opponent to call 2 cards from their hand and then dominate them, so you're -2. And then on GB3, which is where your soul gets ruined, those dominated cards get +10k and a crit, so you're guarding 15, 20 in a format where you are just not that many cards. You had maybe G-Guards. Very few clans had G-Guards to interact with the dominated units. Ange had one with Citron, right? Yeah, Citron, where you could call over the dominated unit, but again, you're still negging 2, so you're still kind of sad, blinking on the other ones that played around it. But that's just an example of the just hand pressure Rene had, and it was easily the most popular deck in that format at the time because it was so easy. You didn't have to think. All you had to do was write up on Zenki, rip a card from their hand, and then like you didn't even have to bother grade 2 gaming. You just passed. Then your opponent stride did their thing, pretended they're doing something. Then you most likely just G-guarded and jumped the GB 2 or 3 Rene, and then they just die. It's not a good time.
The true end of G era was marked with its final product release, PCB07 Diva's Festa. The final set of Vanguard in the G era was Bermuda Triangle, and this is where the Ferris wheel grinds to a halt. The meta at this time was not all Bermuda all the time, mainly because it was Team League and you had trios and you couldn't play 3 Bermudas in one tournament. ZTB and Dominate could still put up a fight, as well as the other GBC14 decks. However, the main reason that Bermuda was still a carriage in the Ferris wheel wasn't because it completely overwhelmed the meta, but it's because the main deck from Bermuda, which was GB2 Harmony Ange, was the deck. It was way better than ZTB, and it was way better than Dominate, and it was just the combination, the perfect combination of early game consistency and aggro with the ability to set up a finisher on the first stride to actually win the game on the second stride. This deck took every single paradigm that enabled the Ferris wheel meta up until now and put it all into a single deck. It is worth mentioning that the other Bermuda decks were still powerful in their own right. Both Shushu and Coral had their strengths and could easily compete with the likes of GBC14, but there was no question that Ange was just heads and shoulders above everybody else.
Probably the most impactful set in end of G and pretty much the modern era of card fight, because especially its impact in premium, was Diva's Festa, specifically because of Delight Genius Ange. It is arguably the best grade 3 ever printed. It searched your deck for anything you wanted, it plussed you, it let you replay stuff. Hell, I don't even think I was playing the card right, and I won every single round but 2, because I misplayed twice, and then I got stuck on grade 2. The card just, it broke the game because it was an on-ride +2, and then it had a stride effect of +2 as well. It didn't need to do that. Other noteworthy cards in that set was Spirited Star Troyes. While Riviere wasn't that popular at the time, that card's impact will not be understated. It's now banned in premium. Card's insane. Superior writing when they changed the star rules was a mistake. Other noteworthy stuff is the Coral deck. Coral deck was actually pretty strong. You had Aquas, where you could play 6 PGs, put more Corals to Soul, make your Corals really big. Arguably, I think it was better than Ange at the time, because the Ange deck in this meta was Ange Harmony, and it was good because you had a super powerful grade 2 called, I think it was Gift of Effort Shandi. Yeah, Gift of Effort Shandi, where at the beginning of your battle phase, you can +1 and draw a card for every 3 of your units in Harmony. So your deck was just built around on grade 2, calling 2 of these and having 6 Harmony units, so you just draw 4 if your opponent gave you 2 Counterblast. Because the format was so aggressive at the time, most of the time you got 2 Counterblast. That is just how it was. So then you were swinging 3 times, maybe with stands because you had the broken stand. You had Crux, so you could restand those 14k Shandis. It was very, very strong, but it was not what was the strongest cards in the set, which was stuff like Ellie Abuse with Sandy, which was the heal in hand, so you could G-guard a bunch. So basically the BT meta only really added like 2 decks to the format, which was Ange Harmony and Coral, but Ange Harmony saw more success because it felt great to play because you were +4 every turn. Alk turns were pretty interesting. And you also had the pretty generic, pretty good restander, which is Choo Choo popular favorite Tirwa, which we saw a lot of play in premium as well. So when this set came out, everyone knew the reboot was coming, but it should not be understated the impact and power this set had on Vanguard in its history. Some of the best cards straight up have been printed in this set. Tirwa, Ange, Ellie, you know, the banned best G-Guard ever. Also noteworthy was Troyes because of Ange Troyes, which was the best deck in premium for a long time. This led the end of G format to end on a pretty sour note for people because it was so high power, but what we didn't know at the time was that Vanguard's power was actually just increasing. Like you had before, like most of your strong effects were still tied to striding. You needed to stride to do anything really that broken, outside of like Shandi. Like sure, Shandi on grade 2 you +4 it, but you needed Counterblast too. And this, because of the power shift to more V cards with gifts, where you just get so much value for writing a grade 3 on your Vanguard circle, and it didn't really matter what the card actually did. All that mattered is it had a gift and it had the name. So, you know, that's all that mattered. And then the shifting of cards that actually did something on grade 2, 10k triggers, just warped the game and made it ended the wheel of G, end of G, into more like a high-speed race car of power creep.
Of course, the story does end here. After this, we had the infamous V-Series reboot. But that said, for the early stages of the reboot and premium, a certain other card from Diva's Festa continued to be extremely problematic, but that's a story for another time. I will, however, leave you with the knowledge that nearly everything that was good in GPT-14 immediately stopped being good into the reboot and subsequently premium, so perhaps the Ferris wheel didn't actually grind to a halt after all. Maybe the entire wheel just moved somewhere else. Perhaps even now, the wheel continues to spin. That is going to be it for this video on the Ferris wheel meta. Hopefully this has been an insightful history lesson for those of you who are new, or a nice trip down memory lane for those of you who have been here for a while. Either way, this has been yet another Yellow Card documentary production. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If so, please leave a like or a comment, or subscribe to the channel for more content such as this. And we will all see you very soon. Take care. Bye bye.